She was 22 years old, and she broke down to nothing. No home that was hers, no money in any bank, no one left in the world who was bound to catch her if she fell. Just a battered grip, her mother's mother-of-pearl hair comb, and a single-dollar bill folded so many times the ink had cracked along the creases. And with that $1, she bought a shut-up telegraph office at the far end of a dying railroad town in the Wyoming Territory. A narrow clapboard building the whole town had walked past for 20 years without once turning a head. The roof leaked. The floor had buckled. Men loafing outside the depot laughed into their collars and said the girl had gone and spent her last dollar on a shed full of dead wire. But what nobody knew, what not one living soul had known in 20 years, was that inside the wall of that little office, sealed up in the dark between the studs, was something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a moment and hit subscribe, then tell us down in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Her name was Marguerite Falk, though the 2 or 3 people who ever truly loved her had only ever called her Rita, and by the time she was 22 there was no one left alive to call her anything at all. She was born in a narrow frame house beside the tracks in Bitter Springs, a hard little railroad town out on the Wyoming high desert, where the wind came off the sage 1,000 miles wide, and the trains went through, day and night, east and west, carrying the whole roaring world past a town that would never once be part of it. Her mother, Cecile, was the town's telegraph operator, the only woman in 3 counties who held down a key, and she had a way of sitting very still and listening to the wire, to a room, to her own daughter, that made you feel, when her attention landed on you, that you were the only thing in the world worth hearing. Her father had gone before Rita could keep a memory of him. A coupling that let go in a switchyard on a black night, the way the railroad took its men. And so it had always been the 2 of them, mother and daughter, in a house that shook gently every time a train went by, and was poor, but never once silent in the way that wounds. There is a thing that runs in certain children long before they own the word for it, and in Rita it ran toward sound, toward the click and rattle of the wire that the whole town heard as noise and that she alone heard as language. When she was 4, she would sit under her mother's telegraph table with her knees drawn up, and while the grown people talked over her head, she would tap her small fingers against the table leg in time, with the sounder overhead, matching it, letter for letter, dot for dot. Before she could so much as read the alphabet, the dots stood for. Her mother came down under the table one evening and found her at it, and did not laugh. She grew very quiet, and she listened to her daughter, tapping the wire's own rhythm back at it, in the dark under the table, and then she gathered the child up and held her for a long time. She used to tell that story for years afterward. She used to say the good Lord had built her girl to hear the things that came down the wire, the true things, the ones sent from far off in the dark, and he had best have had a reason for it. Rita did not understand her then. She would. Her mother died in the autumn. Rita turned 17. A wasting sickness came into her slowly, over a year, so slowly that some days you could tell yourself it wasn't happening at all. Some griefs come down all at once, like a coupling letting go on a black night. This one came the other way, by inches. A little more of her mother gone with each month, until the stillness that had once been her great gift became the whole of her, and then even that was gone. Rita set the wire herself in her mother's last months, 16 and then 17, taking the town's messages so the county wouldn't put another operator in her mother's chair while her mother still breathed. She was good at it. She was better than good. But when her mother died, the railroad's district man came through and told her, not unkindly, that the company did not keep girl operators on as a rule, and there was a young man coming out from Omaha, and that was that. She kept the house one more month on the last of her mother's pay, and then she did not keep it at all. She was 17 and alone, and a girl alone in a railroad town is a thing that the town takes upon itself to arrange. The station master and his wife took her in, not from love, but because a station master is a company man, and a company town watches its company men, and it would not have looked right to let the old operator's girl go onto the road. She was not wanted in that house, and she knew it, and she made herself small and quiet and useful, and she paid her keep in cooking and washing, and in never once letting a complaint past her lips, because complaint, she had learned young, only gives a grudging house the reason it has been looking for. And she took what work she could, and the work that felt like her own, the only work that ever had, she found in the last place anyone would have sent her. There was an old telegrapher in Bitter Springs by then, a man named Alonzo Dieter, pensioned off the line with a bad chest and worse eyes, who kept a little repair bench in the back of the depot fixing keys and sounders and the town's few clocks to have something to do with his hands. He heard, the way old telegraphers hear everything, that the dead operator's girl could take the wire faster than the Omaha boy the company had sent, and it galled him that they'd turned her out, and he took the time with her that no one else in that town had. He taught her the true things, not just the sending and the reading, which she already had in her bones, but the wire itself, how a line is strung and grounded and insulated, how a battery is built up from copper and zinc and blue vitriol, how a fault travels and where it hides, how to walk a dead line with a pocket galvanometer until you find the one place the current leaks away into the ground. He taught her that a message and a machine are the same thing at heart, a true signal buried in noise, and the whole art of the trade. The whole art of a life, he said once, is learning to read the true signal under all the noise the world lays over the top of it. Everybody hears the noise, he told her, tapping his own deaf ear. The hard thing, and the only thing that matters, is to hear the one true note underneath. She did not know, then, how far down into her own life that lesson would carry. She would. She saved what little she could. She kept it in a diamond dye tin, a small flat tin gone soft at the corners, the colors on the label long faded, and she hid it in the wall, behind a loose board in the room the station master's wife had grudged her. By 21, she had $30 in it. By 22, she had close to 50. And a week after her 22nd birthday, the station master's wife found the loose board and the tin behind it, and found in that some small offense to be furious about that was not about the money at all, but about 5 years of a girl in a house that had never once made room for her, and by dark Rita stood out on the cinders beside the tracks, with her battered grip and her diamond dye tin and her mother's mother-of-pearl comb, and the door of the last shelter she had swung shut at her back, and this time the bolt went home and stayed. She was broke, and she was out, both at once. There is no gentler way to put it, and she did not go hunting for one. Old Dieter found her there in the cold blue of that evening, standing in the wash of light from a passing westbound, and he did not tell her he was sorry, which she was grateful for, because sorry was the one commodity Bitter Springs kept in endless supply. Instead, he told her about a town 2 days west along the line, a railroad town called Rel, that the road had bypassed with a cutoff and all but killed, where the depot stood dark, and the old telegraph office at the end of the street had been shut and forgotten for 20 years, and where, he said, the county would hand a dead building over near enough for nothing to anybody willing to shoulder the back taxes. He said, if she wanted to keep a wire of her own, with no company man's leave, that was the place to go do it. She had not planned to go anywhere. But standing in the dark with all she owned in one grip and 40-odd dollars in a dye tin, she found she had nothing left in Bitter Springs to plan toward. And so the next morning, she rode the westbound out on a ticket that took the last of 1 week's wages. The road west was long, and it remade the world by slow degrees. Bitter Springs fell behind, and the country opened out into the great tan emptiness of the high desert, the sage running silver-green to a horizon so far off it seemed a rumor. The land was cut here and there by dry washes and low red rimrock, and pronghorns stood off from the tracks and watched the train pass with their black eyes and then float away over a rise like spilled water. The air, when the train stopped to take on water, smelled of hot sage and creosote and iron and faint and cold off the far blue rumor of the mountains, the snow that never wholly left the peaks. The telegraph line ran alongside the tracks the whole way, pole after leaning pole, the wire dipping and rising, and Rita watched it out the window the entire 2 days with the fierce, memorizing attention she gave to anything she meant to keep. And it seemed to her that the wire was a thing being carried somewhere, the way she was, being carried. Both of them strung out west across all that emptiness, toward whatever waited at the end of the line. She had never crossed this stretch of desert in her life, but some part of her seemed to have always known its shape, the way she had known the alphabet of the wire before she knew her letters. Rel, when she reached it at dusk on the second day, was a town the railroad had made and then unmade with the stroke of a surveyor's pen. One short main street of false-fronted buildings, running down toward a depot, went dark. More than half of them shuttered and gray, the paint sand-blasted off their fronts by 20 years of desert wind. A church with a dead bell, a shut hotel. The rails still ran through, but the fast trains did not stop anymore, and the town had the hushed, held-breath quiet of a place the world had finished with. Dieter's old friend met her at the platform where the local let her down. A broad, slow, quiet man named Emmerich, who kept the town's one store and a lifetime's knowledge of every stick of timber and length of wire in that country, and who said little on the walk down the street and let the cold, clean desert dusk do the talking for him. At the far end of the street, where the town gave out against the open sage, he stopped and lifted his chin at a narrow clapboard building standing a little apart from the rest, and he said, "That one. That's the one your Dieter wrote me you'd want to see." It was the telegraph office. A narrow board and batten building, tall and plain, the way telegraph offices were always built. Cheap and quick and functional, a place for a wire and a table and a man to sit the key. The roof had gone soft at one corner where the flashing had failed, and the floor beneath the front window had buckled from 20 years of blown-in wet, and the door hung crooked on a dropped hinge. But the frame, when Rita laid her hand along the corner post, was true. Good fir studs, plumb and square, put up by someone who, cheap as the job was, had still troubled to do it right. The line still ran to it, one dead wire drooping from the last leaning pole to a cracked insulator on the gable end. And through the grimed front window, she could see, in the last of the light, the operator's table still standing in its place, and on it the dark shape of a sounder and a key, left just as the last operator had risen and walked away 20 years before. Whoever had built this office had built it plain, but had built it to stand, and it had. Whose was it, she asked. Emmerich scratched his jaw. Belonged to the last operator here, a man named Barnabas Quill. Sat this key near 40 years, all the way back to when Rel was a division point, and every message between the coasts came clicking through this room. Best fist on the whole division, they said. You could tell his sending from any other man's on the line, clean as print. Died the year the cutoff opened, and the trains quit stopping. No wife, no kin anyone ever found. Counties held the place for the taxes ever since. He looked at her sidelong in the failing light. Taxes come to $1. $1. Nobody's wanted it in 20 years. Folks say a room that heard that much news, good and bad, births and deaths, and the end of the war, all of it coming through that one wire. A room like that holds on to some of what it heard. $1, she said. $1, he said, and more work alone than a body ought to take up. The next morning she walked to the little county office and unfolded her single cracked dollar bill and laid it flat on the clerk's counter, smoothing the creases with her thumb. The clerk, a tired man with garters on his sleeves, looked at the bill, then at the girl, and asked was she certain. Land didn't go for $1. $1 was a meal and a bed, which meant one of two things. Either the whole thing was a mistake, or the place was so worthless that in 20 years not one living soul had wanted it. "It's what I've got," Rita said, "and it's what I want." Something behind the man's tired eyes gave way. He drew up the papers and turned them, and she signed her name in her mother's still, careful hand, and when it was done, he reached below the counter and set a small iron key on the wood between them, black with age and cold as a rail in winter against her palm. "Come with the deed," he said. "Been in that drawer 20 years. It's yours now." And that key, cold and black and small in her hand, was the first thing in all the wide world that belonged to Marguerite Falk and to no other living person. If you're already caught up in Rita's story, do us one small kindness and hit that subscribe button. It truly is the thing that keeps stories like this one being told. She walked out to the telegraph office that same afternoon, the iron key cold in her coat, her breath smoking white in the thin desert air. Up close, the little building was both worse and better than it had looked from the street. Worse because 20 years of wet weather had come in at the bad corner and swelled the floor into a low wave and stained the plaster brown to shoulder height. Better because the frame, when she set her shoulder to the corner post and leaned her whole weight into it, did not give a hair, good fur, plumb and square, and true after 40 years of use and 20 more of standing empty. She walked the whole of it before she said a word, reading the frame the way Dieter had taught her to walk a dead line, for the sound signal, under the dead-looking noise, and under all its ruin, the little office was sound to the bone. Whoever had raised it honestly, cheap as it was. At the door, she stopped. The old lock was seized with 20 years of rust, and for a long moment the small key would not so much as move. And she thought she had crossed 2 days of desert to buy a door that would never open. She set her shoulder to it and worked the key slow, no forcing, the way Dieter had shown her to coax a sticky relay back to life. Patience and a drop of oil and time. And just when she'd near given it up, the wards turned with a small iron complaint, and the bolt drew back. The crooked door dragged open across the buckled floor, shrieking. 20 years of silence torn open all at once, and the shut-in breath of the place rolled out over her, dust and mouse and old paper and, under it all, the faint dry ghost of hot metal and gutta percha and battery acid that soaks forever into the walls of any room where the wire has worked for 40 years. She stood in the low doorway, with the westering sun at her back throwing her shadow long across the buckled floor. And then she stepped inside. The office was one narrow room, dim and closed. The operator's table still stood before the window, the key and the sounder waiting on it under 20 years of dust, the swivel chair pushed back a little from the table, as though the man who sat it had only just stepped out. A shelf of message flimsies had gone yellow and curled. A dead battery jar stood green with corrosion in the corner. On the wall by the table, a railroad clock had stopped at some forgotten hour. It was a wreck, but it was hers, and it was standing, and the bones of it were true. She turned slowly in the middle of the little room, and she felt the shape of the life that might be lived here come down over her the way the true signal comes up clean out of the noise, once a hand knows how to listen for it. That first night she slept on the sound end of the floor in her bedroll, a small careful fire going in an old sheet iron heater she'd righted, and the desert outside was loud with sounds she had never heard from a bed of her own. The endless wind combing the sage, a coyote's thin cry far off, and another answering. And now and again, deep in the night, the long, low moan of a fast train going through Rel without stopping, its headlights sweeping once across the ceiling and gone. She lay awake a long while, and somewhere in the deep of the night the fear went out of her, and something steadier came in behind it, something that felt almost like a dead wire coming alive under the hand, a faint, far current, arriving at last out of the dark. She began the next morning with the table and the buckled floor, because those were the working heart of the little room, and a body ought to know the ground it means to stand on. The table was sound. The floor she meant to take up and relay, and it was while she was prying the swelled boards away from the base of the wall beneath the window, working carefully so as not to split the good ones, that her pry bar knocked hollow against the wall itself, low down by the mopboard. Not the flat dead thud of a stud, but a hollow drum, the sound of a cavity where no cavity ought to be. She stopped. She rapped along the wall with her knuckles, stud to stud, the way you tap a hull for rot, and everywhere it came back tight and solid until, in the bay just under the window, where the operator's knees would have been 40 years, it came back hollow. She brought the lantern close and looked, and she saw that the plaster there had been cut once, long ago, in a neat square, and patched back so careful you'd never see it unless you were down on your knees with a light, hunting for the true thing under the smooth face of the wall. She knelt over it for a long moment in the lantern light. Then she rose and went to find Emmerich, because there are some walls a person ought not open entirely alone. He came back down the street with her and looked a long while at the neat old patch low in the wall and scratched his jaw the way he did. "Barnabas Quill," he said quietly, "sat the key here 40 years, and an operator on a division point in those days handled more than messages. He handled the company's money that came down the line, the payroll wires, the drafts, and half the private business of every soul in 3 counties besides. Because everything a body needed to send or to hide went out over that one wire and through that one man. Folks always wondered where Quill's own money went. Never spent, never banked that anybody knew, and nobody asked him. He wasn't a man you asked. He looked at the patched square. Reckon we're about to find where he kept it." She cut the old patch away with a chisel, following the neat lines the dead man had left, and the plaster came free in one square piece, and behind it, framed in between 2 studs, was a hollow, dry as tinder, lined careful with tin so the mice could never reach it, a cavity a careful man had built into his own wall and hidden behind his own plaster and sat in front of, at his key, for however many of those 40 years. The lantern light swelled into it, and in the hollow, stacked one atop another between the studs, sat a row of small tin document boxes, japanned black, each one shut with a little brass hasp, and each one, she saw as she brought the light close, marked on the end in white paint with a year. The top box read 1866. She lifted it out and looked past it, and the boxes went down and down between the studs, one below the next, the painted years running back. 1865, 1864, 1863, a box for every year the old man had sat the key, one laid quietly into the wall each year and sealed away in the dark instead of spent or banked, the way so many out here trusted no bank at all, and had good reason not to. She lifted the first box down. It was heavy, the dense, deep, unmistakable heaviness of metal that no other weight in the world quite counterfeits. She set it on the sound part of the floor and thumbed back the little brass hasp, stiff with age, and lifted the lid. Gold. Coins wrapped tight in oilcloth, gone stiff as shingle. Double eagles on the top, their milled edges still sharp under the dust. Half eagles beneath them, and under the gold a bed of old silver dollars worn smooth by the hands of 20 years dead. She lifted the next box down. More of the same. A third held no coin at all but paper, banded and tied. Old railroad drafts and territorial notes and greenbacks, folded and pressed flat. Box after box down the wall. One for every year the old man had sat his key and read the whole roaring world go by on the wire, and said a little of what came his honest way down into the dark of his own wall, a year at a time. Some years were heavy. The box marked 1869, the year the last rail was laid, and the whole country wired itself together end to end, straining its little hinges. Some were near empty. The box marked 1862, a hard war year, held only a coin or two and a folded flimsy. More than 20 of them, down the wall, stud to stud. More than 20 years of still man, still saving. Rita sat down on the buckled floor with a double eagle cold and bright in her palm, and her throat went tight and she did not cry. But it was a near thing. Emmerich said nothing. There was nothing worth the saying over it. They counted the better part of 2 days, and when they were done, and an honest coin man had come out on the local from the county seat and weighed the gold on his own balance and read her fair figures, the whole of it, gold and silver and paper together, came to a little better than $10,000. More money than Marguerite Falk had ever let herself imagine touching in one whole life. But it was not the money that undid her. In the last box, the one at the very bottom of the wall, beneath the final oilcloth bundle, lay a flat packet, and folded inside it a small bundle of yellowed message flimsies, tied with waxed line, and one sheet folded over on itself, its wax seal cracked with the years, addressed in a fine, even operator's hand. To the one who opens my wall. Rita broke what was left of the seal with fingers that would not quite hold steady, and unfolded the sheet, and read it there on the buckled floor in the swinging lantern light. "My name is Barnabas Quill," it began. "I was born in the state of Maine in the year 1824, and came west to a young man with a good ear, a fast fist, and nothing else in the world to my name. I took this key in 1856, when Rel was a division point and the whole traffic of a continent came clicking through this one room, and I sat it near 40 years, and in all that time I never once passed along a message I had no right to read, nor sent a false word down the line for my own gain, which in this trade is a thing I hold worth more than everything in that wall, though I do not look for the world to believe it of a man who died looking poor. Whoever you are, reading this by whatever light, the gold in my wall is not the treasure. It never was. It is only what I could not bring myself to spend, laid by a little each year, and it has done me not one particle of good, sealed up in the dark while I grew old and alone in front of it. I always told myself I was saving it toward something. In 40 years I never once said what something was. That was the whole of my mistake, and I have had a long quiet time out here at the end of the line to come to understand it. I heard the whole world go by on this wire. Every marriage and every death, every fortune made and every one lost, the end of the war, the driving of the last spike, all of it came clicking through my hand, and I set it down on a flimsy and passed it along and kept none of it for myself. I heard about everyone's life but my own. Do not do as I did. Do not sit so still in front of the wall, listening to the world go by, that you forget to live the one life the wire was never going to bring you. If you have found this, then you came into my office for a reason. Maybe you needed a place to stand in the world. Maybe you were building towards something. Maybe you were only lost, the way I was lost, the way I stayed lost a great deal longer than any soul ought. I was every one of those things once. I hope this serves you the way I never let it serve me. The money is not the point. It was never anything but the key. What matters is the door it opens, and that you walk through it, and that you do not spend your one life the way I spent mine, hearing the world instead of living in it. The office is plain but honest and well-framed, and she will stand another 100 years if you keep the water off her. Some buildings are like that. Some lives could be, if only we would let them. Barnabas Quill, his hand. Sent to no one, over no wire, and left in the wall. April 1876, Rita read it twice. Then she folded it careful, and held it in her lap and sat a long time. In the cold quiet of the office, the old man had built and sealed and sat before for 40 years, and she thought about her mother, sitting very still at her own key, listening to the wire, and to a room, and to her own small daughter, as though each were the only thing worth hearing. She thought about herself at 4 years old, tapping the wire's rhythm back at it in the dark under the table before she knew her letters. She thought about old Dieter, tapping his deaf ear, telling her the only thing that ever mattered was to hear the one true note under all the noise. And she thought about Barnabas Quill, 20 years dead, the best fist on the whole division, who had heard the entire roaring world go by on his wire for 40 years and set every word of it down and kept none for himself, and who had died old and alone in front of a wall full of gold he never once let himself want. And she understood, sitting there on the buckled floor, a thing she would carry to the end of her own days, that the gold in the wall was the smallest part of what the old man had left her. He had left her a place to stand, and a warning, and a door. The money was not the treasure. The money was only the key. Months later, the telegraph office was a different building, and Marguerite Falk was a different woman. She did the work right because Dieter had taught her that a thing done true once will outlast a thing done fast a dozen over. She used a little of the gold and left the rest banked in the county seat, drawing only what the work called for. She stripped the failed flashing at the bad corner and set it new in bright tin, soldered tight, so the water could never come in there again. And she jacked the low wave out of the floor and relaid the buckled boards with clean fur, ripped and planed by hand until they lay flat and true under a booth heel. She rehung the crooked door on new iron. She scraped the water-stained plaster and floated it smooth and fresh. She set the old railroad clock going again on the wall, and she cleaned 20 years of green corrosion out of the battery jars and built the cells up, new from copper and zinc and blue vitriol, the way Dieter had taught her, and she cleaned and adjusted Barnabas Quill's own key and sounder until they answered clean and quick under her hand. And then, on a bright cold morning, she climbed the last leaning pole with a set of climbers and mended the one dead wire where it had parted at the cracked insulator, and spliced it true, and came down and sat at the old man's table and closed the key. And the wire answered, far off down the line, out of 20 years of silence, a sounder somewhere clicked back. A section operator 2 towns west, startled, asking who was working the old dead rel office after all this time. And Marguerite Falk, sitting at Barnabas Quill's key with her mother's clean, still hand, sent back her name, and the wire carried it away west into the desert. Alive again, the way it had not been alive in 20 years. She kept the wall hollow. She never filled it back, and she never plastered it over. She liked knowing it was there, and what it had held, and she fitted a little door into it instead, a cupboard where the wall had been a hiding place. She kept one empty box, too, the one marked 1856, the year the old man took the key, and set it on the shelf above the table, with his letter folded inside, beside her mother's mother-of-pearl comb. She did not transform the telegraph office. She restored it. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole of the thing. The people of Rel came around slowly, the way desert people do. First they were curious, then they were neighborly, then one morning they had simply decided she belonged, which is the dearest coin such people ever spend and the hardest to earn. Emmerich's wife, a small quick woman named Hedwig, took to carrying a covered dish of sauerbraten down the street every Sunday and would hear nothing of pay. "You eat that, Kindchen," she'd say. "You are too thin for this wind." An ancient section boss named Padraig, who'd worked the line in the division days and known Barnabas Quill to nod to, came and sat in the good chair by the door of an evening and told her the things the old man had told no one about the girl back in Maine who had promised to come out on the cars and never came, about the one-eared depot cat named Sligo that had ridden the old man's shoulder at the key for a dozen years and lay buried now under the big rabbit brush behind the office. Rita wrote some of it down in a little book she kept in the box on the shelf, building the portrait of a man she had never met out of the scraps that had outlived him. And she opened the wire, not as it had been. Rel was no division point anymore, and never would be again, and the whole roaring traffic of a continent would never again come clicking through that one small room. But as a working office, the only one for 40 miles of failing towns and lonesome ranches, word ran out over the wire and down the wagon roads that the young woman at the end of Rel's street would send your message true and read you back what came, honest as old Quill himself, and would sit with a body while the hard ones came in and never once let a private word travel further than the two of them. And they came. Homesteaders wiring for seed money, a rancher sending east for a doctor, a mother trying to reach a son gone to the mines, a man with a death to send and no other way to send it. And Rita took each one at the key, and she heard the true note under all the noise the way her mother had, the way Dieter had taught her. And she carried each message clean and kept none of it. Some of what came down the wire to her was very hard. She took it anyway, and she sat with the ones who had to hear it, and she did not, as the old man had done, only hear the world go by. She lived among the people whose lives came through her hand. That, she had decided on the buckled floor with his letter in her lap, was the whole difference between the old man's life and the one she meant to make. One evening, in the late gold of autumn, she sat on the step she had rebuilt with her own two hands and watched the light run long and amber across 1,000 miles of sage, and the one-eared cat's great-grand kitten dozed on the warm boards beside her. And she thought about all of it. About her mother, sitting so still at her key, who had listened to her 4-year-old tap the wire in the dark and knew, already, the whole shape of her daughter's life. About old Dieter tapping his deaf ear, who had taught her that the only thing that ever mattered was to hear the one true note under all the noise. About Barnabas Quill, 20 years in the ground, the finest fist on the division, who had heard everyone's life but his own, and learned too late the one message the wire was never going to bring him. There is a pull that runs in some of us, quiet and old, long before we have the words to give it a name. We cannot always say why we want what we want, nor where the wanting means to carry us. But the pull is real, and if you follow it far enough it tends, in the end, to bring you somewhere. For some, that somewhere is a place they were born to. For others, it is a place they must go out and find, 2 days west along a dying line, through a shrieking door, behind a patch of plaster that 20 years of townsfolk swore was nothing but wall. A place near everyone else has already given up on. The shape of it does not matter. What matters is whether you can stand inside it, close the key, and hear something answer at last, out of the dark. Something that says this is the place. This is where I begin. Marguerite Falk was 22 years old and broke down to nothing. One cracked dollar bill folded soft in her hand, and she spent it on a shut-up telegraph office the whole town swore was worthless. It was the best dollar she ever spent. and not, in the end, for the gold in the wall. For the door it opened, and the wire it brought back to life, and the one true life she chose to live in front of it, instead of only listening to the world go by. If this story moved you tonight, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us down in the comments, what's the one true note in your own life you've had to learn to hear under all the noise? We read everyone, and we would love to hear your story. See you in the next one.